we're going to get started. Everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you guys all for coming. We want to thank the Hull-House for having us here, and also this event is put on in conjunction with Illinois Humanities. They helped us put this on and allowed us to do it for free. And Illinois Humanities has kind of a similar mission to The Point in this sense of wanting to bring kind of a humanistic perspective or bring the humanities to bear on issues that are actually affecting people and that people are thinking about and talking about, both in their personal and cultural lives. This is the second of, I don't know if you guys have seen, so this is The Point magazine that sponsors, is sort of sponsoring this event, and this is the second event in what we've been calling our Examine Life series, which is a kind of panel event we try to do in conjunction with each issue, asking, the last one was on privacy, what is privacy for? This one is on protest, what is protest for? So yeah, we invite you, if you like the discussion, to look at our website, thepointmag.com, and check out the magazines, which are available out front also. We've got three people with us to talk about protests tonight. Bill Ayers on the far right is
Just kidding. When you said far right, I got
quick.
From the perspective of the audience, you're on the far right.
That's true. We're going to talk a lot about perspective. He's a former professor of education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Ayers has written extensively about social justice and democracy, education, and the cultural contents of schooling, and teaching as an essentially intellectual, ethical, and political enterprise. He's the author of Fugitive Days, a memoir about his time as an activist in the 60s, which we'll talk about soon. Janaé Bonsu is the National Policy Chair of the Black Youth Project 100, a collective of black activists and organizers dedicated to creating justice and freedom for all black people. Bonsu has led BYP 100's anti-criminalization and police accountability campaigns, and she co-authored their recent Agenda to Build Black Futures. This is a bad printout of it, but I think she said there's some outlines of it up front, right?
Yeah, on the table of it.
And that is a sort of program, sort of an economic program that they've put out, focusing on black youth and economic opportunity. Charles Mills is a professor of philosophy at Northwestern University. He's a scholar of social and political philosophy and works particularly on oppositional political theory as centered on class, gender, and race. He's the author of 5 books, including The Racial Contract, which I highly recommend. So I want to just start out with a question for all three of them. The way this will work is I'm going to ask a couple questions to each of the panelists, and then, fairly early on I want to open it out and let you guys talk. And ask questions. The only thing I'll ask is when you have a comment or a question, to try and direct it to something that one of the panelists has said or to a specific panelist. It's just a way of trying to make this a conversation as opposed to the other things it could be. So the first question I'm just going to ask to all three of the panelists, starting with Janaé. We have in the symposium, there's an essay by the former Congressman Barney Frank from Massachusetts, and it's called Against Demonstrative Politics. And Frank basically says, his point in this essay is that in a democratic society where everyone can vote, really energy should be focused on what he calls participation in the political process, by which he means things like registering to vote, communicating with representatives, and then rewarding them or punishing them electorally based on what they do. He therefore thinks a lot of public demonstrations on the left are kind of a waste of time. He thinks they're narcissistic, self-defeating, they may be satisfying emotionally, but often they don't help push legislation, and they often can galvanize opposition, in fact, to the causes that people are marching for. he gives as a counterexample to the emphasis on public demonstrations that we have on the left often, the example of the National Rifle Association, which he says is an organization that has had an enormous impact on policy despite never organizing any public demonstrations, and also pushing policies that are broadly unpopular with most of the country. So I wanted to just ask each person here to respond to Frank's challenge on sort of how you would justify putting energies, particularly in activism, in public protests.
Yeah, I had a hard time reading this essay. In short, I disagree. But I will say that I do in part agree with the point that he makes that right-wing folks, or the more conservative bunch, if you will, does do a better job at engaging members of Congress and legislators on the federal level. But I would push back on that really hard for local and state politics. And I think Chicago and Illinois are great examples because, you know, aldermen, even state reps and state senators are way more accessible than, you know, a member of Congress at the federal level, right? And, you know, folks within my organization at BYP 100 and other comrades in this movement have definitely had, you know, one-on-one or group meetings with folks in city council and have gone down to Springfield. And so, and I think that local politics does have a more immediate impact you know, on folks than folks in Congress. So I think his perspective speaks to his positioning as, you know, a former member of Congress. But yeah, I just don't think that that is true locally. So could liberal or progressive or radical or otherwise left of center folks do a better job at lobbying, so to speak, federally? Sure, of course. But there's a much larger point that I totally disagree with, and that is the notion that everyone can vote and everyone can participate in this democracy. He builds this argument on the flawed notion that everyone is welcome in the polity when that is absolutely not true. So to shame or dismiss demonstrative politics as a waste of time is to reinforce this exclusion of people like undocumented immigrants or the over 6 million people in this country with felony convictions that cannot vote, that they're literally disenfranchised. So you take states like Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Virginia, and West Virginia, who folks with felony records in those states will never ever have the right to vote unless those states change their laws. So it doesn't matter if they finish their probation or parole sentences, it doesn't matter. They will never get that right to vote back. Then you have a slew of other states who locks out folks who are currently incarcerated or on probation or parole. There's only 2 states in the entire 50 states of this country, that is Vermont and Maine, that place no restrictions on folks with felony convictions to vote. 2 out of 50. And so, call me a conspiracy theorist, but I don't think that it's coincidental that in a country that incarcerates Black and brown bodies at the astronomical rate that it does and has done for decades, in turn, on the same hand, dilutes those same people out of the political mix, so to speak. So yeah, MLK in 1968 said that riot is the language of the unheard, and I think that's absolutely true, and I would just expand that to say protest is the language of the unheard. And so for people who literally cannot participate in more institutional forms of advocacy, protest is the way to do it. So yeah, there's so many points that I can make about this, and maybe I'll come back around to make some additional ones, but yeah, he was totally off the mark with that.
You want to pick up, Charles?
Yeah, I think there's definitely in the article the danger of dichotomizing either you do this or you do this. Whereas, and I think it's clear that people who are sympathetic to the cause of the oppressed, of the subordinated, should be sort of working in both fronts. In other words, you want to encourage people to take part in the political process because it's well documented that it's the middle and upper classes and it's the right-wing groups who are better funded. They have the time, they have the money, they have the ability to sort of hire organizers, which people on the left usually don't have that amount of funding. So to use the NRA as an example, sort of assumes that people who are sort of doing progressive politics are going to have the same kind of resources. So certainly there should be participated in the electoral process. We're seeing right now with the Sanders campaign what's possible in terms of exciting people, in terms of mobilizing millions of Americans, getting all these small donations from across the country. But there's also a need, as Janaé just pointed out, to sort of assume something that is not the case. And there's a long history in the US of using categories that are basically imported from Europe. So if you're on the left, whether it's sort of Marxist left or the social democratic left, there's a tendency to sort of frame the US with these imported categories that marginalize the importance of race. So say the US is a liberal democracy, or at worst a flawed liberal democracy, not looking at the extent to which race has structured that democracy. Or if you're further left, you say the US is a capitalist society, again not looking at the extent to which this capitalism has been racialized. So it means that in terms of the overarching conceptual framework within which you're sort of trying to understand politics, it's really crucial to sort of start off with a sort of right set of assumptions. Otherwise you're going to be deeply misled. As Janaé has just pointed out, it's nominally a liberal democracy, but in fact there is of course a long history of disenfranchisement of black Americans. People get the vote for a short time during Reconstruction, the vote is then taken away, you don't really get it again until the 1960s. The Voting Rights Act, I'm sure people know, following Supreme Court decisions, has been crucially weakened with the Shelby decision, so it means it sort of opens the door for far more challenges, sort of bringing back the memories of the 1890s, early 1900s, where you had this sort of systematic process of making sure that black voters were disenfranchised. There's felon disenfranchisement that she was just talking about, and there's also things like making sure that there are fewer places you can vote in areas where minorities are concentrated. If you go back to 2000 and in what happened in the Florida election. So to sort of frame the US as just a liberal democracy in an unqualified way, that's hopelessly naive, obviously, given the actual history of exclusion of people from that promise. And then in terms of protest, to sort of just put it down, sort of feel good politics, again that's misleading because especially for the subordinated, protest plays a crucial role in terms of the affirmation of self-respect. If you think of the 1950s and 60s, sort of making allowance for the sexist language of the time, but black Americans carrying placards saying, "I am a man." This is basically sort of the affirmation of black personhood in a society built on the denial of black personhood. So just as Black Lives Matter are saying the same kind of thing, you have to affirm that Black Lives Matter, you have to affirm that blacks are persons because of this history of exclusion from personhood. So I'd say that the whole framework of this analysis presupposes a very idealized picture, and then once you get the actual picture, you get a very different sense of an option. But as I say, they should not be counterposed either this or this. People are progressives, people are concerned about social justice, should be basically doing both.
Yeah. Couple of points. First, I think we should understand, Barney Frank starts with the premise that political activity is voting. And I agree wholeheartedly with what's been said about the need to fight for universal voting rights. And disenfranchisement takes so many, heinous forms. It's not just limiting the ballot. That's important. Doing away with the Voting Rights Act is important. But it's also negative advertising. It's also making everybody disgusted with the whole process. It's also polling. These are all things that encourage disenfranchisement. And frankly, the people in power have no interest in universal voting rights because they're in power precisely because if everybody voted and everybody were aware of the issues, they'd be gone. And so I think but I think it's also important to while we fight for voting rights and insist on it as a basic fundamental democratic and human right, we have to also understand that it plays one role in being a participatory citizen of a democracy, only one role. And there are many, many other things, protest being one, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But there's a link between organizing, activism, public protest, movement building, and fundamental change. And the link is that it's not elected leaders who bring us change, it's we who bring change to the elected leaders. Or another way of saying it, when everybody was kind of in the mode of, could Obama save us? Our answer should have been, with any luck, we could save Obama, but it doesn't work the other way around. It just doesn't work. Because if you think even a casual glance at history, Lyndon Johnson passed the most far-reaching civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, and he was not part of the Black freedom movement. He was a cracker from Texas. So, what made him do the right thing was fire from below. Franklin Roosevelt was not part of the labor movement, and he passed the most far-reaching labor legislation in history. He was not part of it. What made him do it? Fire from below. Abraham Lincoln wasn't part of an abolitionist party ever. And so what made him do it? The abolitionist movement. So if you are concerned about being, a participating member of a democracy or a moral person or an activist, the rhythm is, simple to say and excruciatingly difficult to enact. The rhythm is you have to open your eyes and pay attention to the world. You can't know how to act in this vast and confusing whirlwind if you're not paying attention. So paying attention is important. A second piece is that you have to be astonished, never cynical, never used to injustice, always astonished at the pain people can visit upon one another, but also at the love that we're capable of, astonished at all of it. Then you have to act, and then you have to doubt. And that is a really important rhythm to me, because acting is important, but if you don't doubt and rethink, then you're doomed to kind of act in as Barney Frank warns, in a narcissistic, self-referencing kind of way. But if you doubt, if you question, and I think the doubt should take a very specific form. You take an action, and then you ask yourself, and you, with others, ask yourself, did I learn something, and did I teach someone something? If those things happen, then it was potentially a good action. But what's interesting in Frank's article is he goes through endless examples of people acting in a way that embarrassed him, and he's very focused on the gay queer movement. And so he doesn't want anybody to be flamboyant at all. And you're like, really? How boring, but it's this kind of sense that they will take away from us our little gains that we've made. So there's a fundamental problem. Even his own experience in the gay movement is one where the people who took the extreme actions, ACT UP and so on, the people who protested, actually brought it to the public, made a public space. And that's, in Frank's case, it's a clear example of what Charles was referring to. They were humanizing themselves by creating a space for public discourse around an issue that people were ignorant about and backwards in. That was a very important kind of thing. He discounts that. He says people coming in costume undermined our ability to pass legislation. And I think the second part Charles touched on, but this is the other part of Frank's argument that's wrong. The right doesn't out-organize us. The right outspends us. The NRA didn't out-organize us. They went to every congressional district and they said, you either vote with us on this agenda or we're going to spend $1 million on your opponent. The other group that did that was AIPAC, the Israeli lobby. And they did it in every district. Why would some congressman from central Montana give a shit? And he votes straight down the line. Why? Because because the Congress is a well, unlike Barney Frank, who says this is all dependent on a faith in electoral government to bring the changes, but I don't have that faith in the system that it works well,
Bill,
because of money.
But people on the left could use money in that way, right? I mean, there is money on the left.
I don't know. I'm looking for it. But what I'm saying is, AIPAC's another example, but again and again, Congress is, on the auction block, so you can buy Congress, and now it's clearer than ever. What is the number, John? 58 families have spent 80% of the donations to...
158 families.
158 families. it's a difference, but don't want to exaggerate, but have to spend 80% on the current election. So as long as you allow that, the thing is for sale.
So, yeah,
Go ahead.
I want to just build on, so word to everything you just said, but so on the point of bringing change to, politicians or elected officials or whatever, I think that's a really important point. So I'm currently a PhD student, and I like to nerd out on research. So just to give just a little bit of data on this. So there's a scholar, his name is Doug McAdam, and he wrote a book called Political Process and the Development of Black Insurgency. And it looks at, basically political movement or social movement from 1930 to 1970. And there's this graph in this book that basically charts the number of what he terms movement-initiated events between, 1948 to 1970 or something like that. And so basically a movement-initiated event could be a boycott, a strike, a sit-in, a mass demonstration, protests in general. I think that's another point too, is that protests can take more than one form, right? But I'm sure we can talk about that more later. But the point I'm trying to make is between 1963 and 1968, with 65 being at its peak, the number of movement-initiated events was astronomical in America. In 1965, there was about 660 movement-initiated events in that year. America was turned up that year. This is what that means. And it's no coincidence that landmark legislation was passed in that time frame. We're talking about the Voting Rights Act. We're talking about the Civil Rights Act. I mean, it's no coincidence that happened. People have the audacity to say, hey, we might not have the money that these other lobbyists have to buy democracy, but we're going to bring it to your door. And that's what happened. So I think, to me, I can infer that the relationship between protest and policy reform and other types of social change is very strong. And so today in this current movement, we have to absolutely continue in that tradition to bring it to their door, bring the change to them. Because, I'm trying to look for the money too. I don't know where it is.
I just think, the thing that's important is that we all recognize that the White House, the Pentagon, Wall Street are sites of power. We sometimes forget that the street, the neighborhood, the factory, the workplace, the classroom, the church is also a site of power. And that's the site of power we have access to. So why we spend time dreamily looking to the other power that we don't have access to? And I'm again saying, yes, we should be building enfranchisement, but we also ought to be mobilizing people from below, demanding their own rights,
Absolutely.
right here, right now.
Protest
Exactly.
arguably shapes legislation and helps move it through the electoral process. So, but I do definitely agree with Charles, or Dr. Mills, I don't know what to call you, that we shouldn't solely engage in electoral politics in absence of protest or vice versa. Like, they absolutely have to work together to be, most effective. So that's it.
So, okay, so now coming down a little bit to talk about some of the more sort of actual protests that are going on right now. Bill, I'm going to start with you on this. A couple months ago, I was reading one of the thousands of articles about the campus protests, around the country right now. It was in U.S. News and World Report, and he says, there was a line, what these new campus Alinsky's, who see themselves as the successors to Abby Hoffman and Bill Ayers, fail to realize is that few people, even among the young, want to be radicalized. The more they stir up trouble, the more likely it is that they push everyone who is not with them to take active positions on the other side, even if it's just by voting. So, first of all, I'm just interested in if you think it's true that current campus protesters see themselves as hailing from a tradition or from, or just what you see as the relation between the protests today and your own generation's protests, and just sort of your perspective, having been through what you went through with Students for a Democratic Society in the 60s, and the different kinds of experiences you had on campus.
Well, quickly, because we could go on and on quickly. I think the 60s is largely a myth and largely a symbol. I think that it's been commodified like everything else, like water and air. And it's something that's sold back to the younger generation as a kind of a wet blanket on your own agency. I mean, I really think that people, I was first arrested in 1965. There were 39 of us arrested for protesting the buildup in Vietnam. And we were surrounded by 3,000 students who wanted us expelled. It wasn't popular. It wasn't, and when did the 60s start? Did it start in 1954? When did it end? I mean, I don't remember looking at my watch on December 31st, 1969 and saying, oh shit, it's almost over. Let's get out. This didn't happen. Nobody lives by decades. So that's my first objection. Second thing is, every generation, by its own, has a responsibility, every human being in every generation, to look at the world and say, what is my responsibility to the world? And that's not unique to the 30s or the 60s. That's always true. And finally, I think we live in an intergenerational world. I don't want to live in a ghetto with people over 70. I mean, I like people. I'm living with one person over 70 over there, but it's not that I have any disdain for them, but I want to be in a world that includes young people like Charles Mills and like Janaé.
That's all relative, I guess.
So I think the idea of generations is nonsense. On the other hand, the question of protest, I think that the question of whether people are going to be radicalized, reality is what radicalizes people. It's looking at reality. And the more we could, and by radical, I mean going to the root, which is the original Ella Baker kind of sense of it. Radical means reframing the issues, understanding the issues, and seeing the ways in which they're connected. It's not just the war in Syria and the war in Libya. They're connected somehow. It's not just, it's not just climate change and war. Those are connected. And so we have to kind of make those connections. That's what I mean by being a radical. And reality radicalizes you. One of the things that sets a radical or a communist against, say, a billionaire or a Buddhist is that we don't want to be radicals. I want to be done with being a radical because I want to make the changes that will make being a radical irrelevant. See what I mean?
Okay. All right. Well, did you have anything? I mean, in terms of the campus protests that went on this last year, did you feel like you had any kind of specific perspective on that?
Not really. I think everybody who's paying attention would have been kind of moved by many things. And the thing that just pops to my mind when you say that, John, is the Missouri football players. I mean, who could have predicted? And the courage, one of the things that's true of protest and activism, protest is in part an existential act of saying, this is how I define myself against the death penalty. Again, it's partly creating a public space and defining yourself in opposition. All protest isn't progressive. I mean, a lot of it isn't. But what I want to be involved in is protest that's against white supremacy, against war, against consumerism and materialism. Those are the kinds of things I want to be involved in. But I looked at the Missouri thing, and I don't think anyone could have predicted the month before it happened that it would have the earth-shaking kind of results that it did have. And that's an example of how we act, not knowing what the future is, but we act in the possibility of a different future. And in that sense, it's often been said that the day before any revolution, that revolution is impossible. And the day after, it's inevitable. And that's what's weird. You don't know. And so you take a risk, and you see how people respond. Barney Frank would say the Missouri football players were all messed up because they shouldn't have protested. They should have elected somebody else. But that's nonsense. They did a great thing.
Okay, so moving over to Janaé. I'm interested sort of in hearing about, with Black Youth Project, when you guys do plan a protest, some kind of direct demonstration. For instance, we talked a little about the movement on 1 Mag Mile after the Laquan McDonald video was released. Sort of how you choose what you choose to do and what your criteria for successful demonstration are. How you know that it's been successful, who you see as the audience for those demonstrations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I first want to say that in talking about protest, I think protest is sort of an umbrella term. You know, I think protest can be strategic, and protest can be unstrategic. Unstrategic in a way of, you know, a protest doesn't always have to have a target, doesn't always have to have a goal, so to speak. Sometimes people take the streets because they feel, you know, I think it's okay for people to feel rage when someone who looks like them is gunned down. I think it's okay for people to be in solidarity with each other, be in community with each other in the streets, and for you to be inconvenienced for just a little bit or turn your car around and you will be okay. So I think we should make space for unstrategic protests, and sometimes BYP 100 and other folks in this movement space have done that, and that's okay. And those have leveraged some power in other situations, and I can come back to that. But in terms of the strategic protests, so I call a strategic protest a direct action, and that's mostly what it is. And a direct action is usually connected to a campaign that has a goal, as a target, or someone who is able to make a decision or acquiesce to your demand, right? And there's short-term and long-term goals. Most campaigns have specific and measurable, you know, kind of milestones, right? And so, whenever we do a direct action or a strategic protest, if you will, it comes after lots and lots of strategic planning. Whenever you see, you know, someone for example, when we shut down the International Association of Chiefs of Police conference back in October, that resulted in 66 arrests. I promise y'all, the day before, we didn't say, you know what would be cool if we shut that shit down tomorrow. That's not what happened. Like, it was months and months of strategy sessions of so what is our messaging? You know, how do we make it so that that we do this and everybody knows why we're doing this? And just another point is that, you know, not all protests. So there are like issue-based protests and issue-based campaigns, and there are some protests that are symbolic. Some protests are just geared towards uplifting a message or narrative to alert other people, both within and outside your base, of what's going on, what's the problem, because some people legitimately don't know. And so yeah, I don't think that every protest or action necessarily has to result in you know, a material, tangible change in some type of a policy or practice. And so yeah, that process for BYP 100 looks like, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? And so yeah, what makes sense? You know, we assign roles. We turn out for it. We do phone banking. We utilize social media. Like, there's so much that goes into demonstrative politics, if you will, that I think from the outside looking in, people are just like, oh, those damn protesters again. They're just mad about police violence and their picket signs. But it's really much more than that. And so I think broadly, the goal, whether strategic or not, is there's no more business as usual. That's it. I think protests and actions seek to disrupt the status quo. That something is wrong, and everybody and their mom needs to know about it, and to dismantle systems of repression, and whatever that looks like in whatever particular issue you're focusing on. And I think that the end goal of any campaign, any direct action or strategic protest should be to shift power relations between the people, those of us on the ground who are you know, whether an excluded or marginalized group that's trying to obtain a goal, and those at the top where like the goal is to absolutely shift power relations. And so yeah, it's a really long drawn out process, and it's not always pretty in planning it out, and sometimes it's not pretty in executing it. But Yeah, did I answer the question?
Yeah,
Okay,
I think
cool.
so.
But I do want to say something to a point that I kind of glazed over earlier. In unstrategic protests having the potential to leverage power in a later situation. To give a local contemporary example of that, back in, don't get me to lying about the month, but it was the day after, or a couple of days after Freddie Gray was killed. And BYP 100 kind of led this mobilization to have a Shy to Baltimore solidarity, like emergency solidarity action, wherein there was no target per se, but people were just mad. People just felt like, damn, that's really messed up what happened to Freddie Gray, and there's so many Freddie Grays in Chicago, and we need to let Baltimore know, we need to let our people here know that like we have to hold each other, we have to love each other, and we just need to hold this space with each other to grieve, right? And so literally it started with a group text from like between me and my ex-co-chair and some other folks in the org, like, yo, we need to do something in response to this. And literally overnight, between calls, Facebook events, Twitter tweets and retweets, we were able to mobilize over 1,000 people to come out to CPD headquarters at 35th in Michigan and took the streets. And we literally marched from 35th all the way down to 55th or 57th in Hyde Park, where once we got to Hyde Park, the police was like, no, y'all ain't coming. They wasn't playing that, which that was really interesting, but that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, it was just amazing how many people we were able to mobilize in such a short period of time. And that scared the shit out of Mayor Emanuel and other city officials to where, you know, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall in the room when he was trying to get us together. But basically, Emanuel was like, I need to sit down with whoever organized this mobilization. And so, you know, my former co-chair had a connection with Emmanuel's, I think his title is chief of staff, someone who was like high ranking in his staff, reached out to us like, hey, the mayor wants to meet with you all. Why? Just like trying to get us and other, you know, youth leaders in this Black Lives Matter movement in a room to talk. Okay, let's see what he's talking about. What does he want? And essentially he wanted to get us together to say, what do you want? Because he was, I think that came as a result of him being scared that Baltimore would happen in Chicago in terms of uprisings, or Ferguson would happen in Chicago in terms of uprisings. Because if we were able to mobilize that many people in such a short period of time in reaction to an adverse event that happened somewhere else, then there's no telling what we could do here. And so, yeah, I think he called that meeting to kind of quell our fear, quell his own fears. And yeah, and so that was an opportunity for BYP 100. We Charge Genocide was in the room, Fearless Leading by the Youth, who was very integral in winning the Trauma Center campaign. Yeah, we were able to say, listen, these are the campaigns that we're working on, these are our demands, what can we do about this? And I don't think that we would have had that opportunity had we not had that unstrategic protest. Right, and so that just goes to show the power that that taking to the streets can do. You know, so I thought that was an important point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a pretty moving example in our symposium, the Melina Abdullah article about sort of the beginning of Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles after the Trayvon Martin verdict, which is very similar kind of. I mean, I think she would probably call that an unstrategic protest.
Yeah.
But it clearly led to a lot of things, and also had a meaning apart from the strategy for the people that were engaging in it.
One of my comrades in this movement, Veronica Morris-Moore, she's I think the co-founder of FLY, said that you know, our best way to get our foot in the door is basically to kick it down, and that is like the realest thing that she's ever said. Well, maybe not, but it is definitely reflective of the role I think protests play in this movement.
So I have one question for Charles, and then I want to open it up and let everyone else talk. So Charles, you've done a lot of work specifically on philosophy and race and politics, and there was a sentence in one of your essays that stuck out to me. You write, "In a broad sense, virtually all African American philosophy is political, insofar as the insistence of one's black humanity in a racist world is itself a political act." I was wondering if you could say more about that, and also about the role you see philosophy as playing. It's sort of in the spirit of thinking about how the humanities bear on some of these issues, what kind of role philosophy could play in protest generally, but specifically in a movement like Black Lives Matter, which certainly speaks to that, the point in the quotation.
Sure. Well, philosophers don't like to get their hands dirty. This goes back all the way to Plato's Republic, where the idea is that philosophers are the guardian class and play the supervisory role. Now, I don't think I can successfully sell that to anybody here. But the idea is that philosophers should not be thought of as utterly useless. Insofar as you can do stuff that's interesting in terms of, as I say, conceptual frameworks, analysis, and particularly normative theory, because normative theory, right and wrong, justice and injustice, that's supposed to be the kind of stuff philosophers do by profession. But unfortunately, the way philosophy has developed over the past 40 years or so is in such a way that social justice stuff has focused on what John Rawls calls a well-ordered society, a society of perfect justice. And while this might seem innocuous or even something that's positive, what it has effectively done is basically bracket questions of corrective justice for unjust societies. If you think about it, you'll see that that's the situation we're always in. It's not the case that anybody on the planet is in a perfectly just society. We're always in unjust societies. So the priority should be what guidelines are most useful for us for correcting existing injustices. So what's called technical in philosophical language, rectificatory justice, corrective justice, that should be the priority for us. But unfortunately, because of the influence of Rawls, it's basically sort of taken a turn away from this. So you get philosophers engaged in these esoteric debates about this perfect just society, which have very little significance for the sort of real life problems we face. So apart from people of color aren't represented in humanities in general, as you know, but in philosophy it's really extreme. So it's like about 1% African American. So it's a very wide profession, both demographically and conceptually. The demographic part is uncontroversial, just a matter of the numbers. The conceptual part, you sometimes get more pushback from mainstream philosophers because they think of philosophy as sort of at a level of abstraction. It includes everybody already. But when you check out the kind of scenarios, the kind of thought experiments, the kind of frameworks, the kind of experience mainstream philosophy is drawing on, it's really the European and Euro-American experience. The experience of people of color in modernity has been an experience of genocide, expropriation, slavery, apartheid, Jim Crow, segregation, and these are not the typical examples you find in philosophy texts when issues of social justice are being discussed. So my attempt, and there are various of us, as I say, not many, but people have been trying to sort of do this in the 70s or so, is sort of try to get black philosophy, African American philosophy, into the philosophical universe, and sort of try to track the distinctive features of the black experience in the modern period. And that experience, we must recall, is of people being categorized as a slave race. So this was one of the sort of very powerful and influential ways of trying to sort of understand slavery of African peoples, that these were the grandchildren of Ham, and as such appropriately a population to be enslaved. And because of the fact that the black body is so phenotypically distinct from the white body, it means that you then get the sort of stigmata of slavery surviving emancipation, not just in the United States, but in the rest of the Americas, throughout Latin America, throughout the Caribbean. So that you get systems of continuing racial domination long after slavery has ended. I mean, last year, as was the 150th anniversary of the Civil War in this country. But obviously, it's still the case that that legacy is still with us today in terms of the problems people are facing. So what I've attempted to, and what others of us sort of work in this area are trying to do, is sort of get African American philosophy and what overlaps with it to a significant extent, critical philosophy of race, sort of more in the mainstream of the profession, which is going to basically attempt to sort of force a recognition of the centrality of race to the making of the modern world. The modern world is created by European imperialism and colonialism, and race and racial ideology and racism and racial domination are central to all of that. So you cannot be serious about social justice and ignore race, because racial injustice is central to the structuring of the modern world. So my hope is that work like this in these areas, certainly not going to have a sort of direct impact. It's not the case that people are going to sort of go into protest carrying their copies of these books or articles.
You never know.
Much as that might be desirable. But I would like to think that in terms of making a contribution to intellectual discussions, we can help to sort of shift the national dialogue. And as I say, bearing in mind that we philosophers, we're supposed to be justice folks. And unfortunately, this role has not been well fulfilled by professional philosophers in recent decades.
Yeah, I mean, we might not come to protest with these books or articles
Why
in
not?
hand.
Why not?
But I would say, like, political education is
Sure,
key
absolutely.
to movement building.
Sure.
People have to have a keen understanding of, what are these systems that we're trying to tear down?
Absolutely.
What is capitalism? What is feminism? What is Marxism? What do we want to build up in place of these systems that we're trying to tear down? And so we need you philosophers and other scholars.
I'm reassured.
to help, facilitate that dialogue. So you have a role in
Yeah,
this.
of course. And it's actually true that, any time people are in motion, they reach for things like the Communist Manifesto. I mean, the Occupy, all over the country, I went to several, and they were all doing political education. BYP has done political education from the start. So it's very important. We should bring the fist in the book, both.
Just in case people didn't hear, the question's about working within the system and sort of what. No, but I mean, once Janaé got in to see Ram, sort of what happened next, and is there a conflict between people in the movement, between people who are sort of want to work within the system and people who are too very skeptical that anything good can come out of working in the system?
It's necessary that we need conflict from
Yeah. So thanks for sharing that story. That's an important question. So I think to the latter or broader question of the utility of working within the system, and I know what you mean, but it's just the easiest way to say it. It's limited or limiting rather. So there are absolutely people within BYP 100 and within this movement broadly who absolutely don't believe in working within the system. Even though electoral organizing and civic engagement is like one of our one key part of BYP 100's theory of change, so to speak, along with direct action organizing and political education, there are people within this organization that don't believe in voting, don't believe in two-party politics, and that's okay. But so I think that there is some utility in being able to sit at the table and say, Ron, there's this ordinance on the city books that allows police officers to arrest people for minor marijuana possession. That needs to change. We need a trauma center on the south side, and put forth all of these demands. And he can say, yeah, hear you, that's cool. Working on it, and not really be working on it. Once you get to that table, the negotiation, so to speak, once you get to the end of the road, what's being offered in response to your demand looks totally different from what you started with. And so I think it's a good thing to get in the door, or a good thing to be able to get an initial meeting or whatever. But that shouldn't be the finish line. You shouldn't say, oh man, we got a meeting with Ron, we won. Like, no, that you still absolutely have to keep that pressure on, those non-institutional forms of advocacy, because like Frederick Douglass says, power doesn't, I'm summarizing, power doesn't acquiesce to anything without a demand, right? And so you have to keep that pressure on, and we have. That meeting with the mayor was, I want to say at least a year ago, at least, and the Triumph Center campaign just won a few months ago.
Yeah.
Just won. And that's great, that's awesome, but it wasn't because we got that meeting. It was because they kept organizing afterwards and kept that pressure on. So yeah, I do think to a point, it's worth trying to start those internal conversations, but not at the expense of outside pressure, for sure.
A question for Janae, a logistical one. Say if you're a young person or someone who hasn't been involved in radical politics and has suddenly had the epiphany and wants to learn more, but has no idea or has no other contacts in learning, say, political education, political theory, or if you have people that want to start an organization, but they have no idea how to even go about organizing or creating a political agenda. How do you go about, say, political education?
So this question's about, for someone new to activism and wants to start learning how to organize, how would you go about starting to do that, to learn how to organize or to start an organization? I want to fold that into another question that I talked with you about a little bit before the panel about the issue of people who might not be centrally part of Black Youth Project or Black Lives Matter, but want to be of help somehow to the movement, to that specific movement. You make this distinction in your conclusion of the agenda to build Black futures about the difference between co-optation and cooperation. So they're two separate questions, but both are sort of in terms of how you would get involved. What are the ways that are helpful for people to do that?
Okay, yeah, definitely two different questions, so I will have to answer them separately. So to your question, it's a good one, and I would say that I think there's a lot of different ways to get involved, so to speak. So I think starting the road to being radicalized or politically educating yourself is kind of different from starting an organization. And just to give a quick side story, like the BYP 100 became an organization out of a very organic moment. The weekend that, or the night that George Zimmerman was acquitted for killing Trayvon Martin, folks in that room was holding hands, waiting for the decision to come down, and when it came down not guilty, that moment stirred just so much emotion in people, and they felt that, that moment, that reaffirmation that Black lives don't matter in America, is what agitated them into wanting to turn action, or anger into action rather, and pain into power. And after grieving, said, hey, we have to really intentionally organize ourselves to change this, and just start a conversation of like, so what is it that we want to see? What are our values? And how can we work together to achieve them? It's just like very organically, slowly but surely became an organization. And BYP 100 is still pretty young as an organization, not even 3 years old. And over time has grown to be, a national organization. But it started with a group of people who felt deeply about issues that affected them, and embarked on this road to both political education and trying to organize together. I can tell you right now that 3-4 years ago, I probably wouldn't have been able to tell you like what Black queer feminism was, or just like I'm still learning every day. And so between just like on my own trying to seek out texts to help me understand these conditions that me and my people are facing and living, as well as trying to seek out what already exists. Maybe it's not necessary to start an organization from scratch, because that's hard. It's very hard to like build an organization and build a movement at the same time. So I would encourage you to survey the landscape first, and if what you're looking for doesn't exist, then start it. I think so. There's two different types of well, I wouldn't say two, but different ways that this could look like. So there's take We Charge Genocide, for example, that they don't exist necessarily as an organization anymore, but it was definitely an organization that didn't take on a 501c3 or C4 status, like didn't have status under the IRS tax code at all, but was absolutely an organization, a collective of people, an intergenerational collective of people who knew that they were against police violence, they were against white supremacy, they were against all of these things, and worked together on project-based stuff, and did really dope things like cop watch trainings and teach-ins and held conferences and things like that, and accomplished a lot of great things together. And once they got to a point where they felt like they accomplished what they needed in this moment, kind of dismantle, and that's okay too. So, I think there's different ways to go about mobilizing you and your friends or other people in your community to accomplish things without necessarily filing for nonprofit status. And so to the point of how to get involved, I started to talk about it in terms of, I think, me personally, I think organizations are the best way to get involved in a movement, whether it's a member-based organization or volunteering with an organization, or if a org has a particular platform, like the Agenda to Build Black Futures, for example. Uplifting that, or really talking with folks in your communities about how you can really spread those messages. I don't know. I just feel like it's one of the simplest but hardest questions to answer. But I do want to get to your second question about co-optation, though. When I wrote that, I was thinking about a specific example. Speaking of We Charge Genocide, they worked really hard on an ordinance called the STOP Act that essentially addresses stop and frisk in Chicago. The ACLU put out a report in 2014, 2015, recently, that really showcased Chicago as being worse than New York in terms of stop and frisk. So We Charge Genocide created an ordinance and really put in a lot of work to making those changes in Chicago. And ACLU knew about this, ACLU of Illinois knew about this and kind of had some backdoor meetings with the mayor and CPD and kind of introduced this more watered down, diluted version of the STOP Act that was able to be moved through. And so essentially they undermined the efforts of young, mostly Black folks and other people of color, and co-opted their efforts. And that was really messed up. And I'm friends with some of these people who were affected by this, and they were hurt and mad, and as well, and they should have been. And ACLU of Illinois, we were talking about resources earlier and how folks on the right, are able to essentially buy democracy. That idea is very similar in the social justice world too, in terms of who has the juice to be able to get in the door and make things happen. And in this case, ACLU of Illinois was able to do that. And and so I just don't want that to happen anymore. And so I felt the need, without calling them out specifically, to say that, yes, young Black people in this country are not just angry about police violence. There's a much larger narrative of our conditions that need to be addressed. We can't have a movement for Black lives without an economic justice platform, and we are able to envision and develop transformative policy in addition to our strategic and non-strategic protests. And in doing this, we need folks who have privilege, who have the juice, so to speak, to respect that and support us, and not undermine our efforts and dilute it to get credit for Black brilliance. And so that's kind of what I meant when I wrote that.
Bill or Charles, either of you guys want to respond to the first question too, about sort of where you guys learned about activism or books that are particularly helpful or things you did?
I will happily defer to my senior activist, Bill Ayers.
I'm
I
not sure
hope
what,
you
I'm
get
not,
back to him though, because I want to hear this guy.
I do too. I
Okay.
want to hear you too, Charles. Go ahead, Charles. You go.
Well, I mean, I've never been actively active in this conference, so I'm sort of seriously disadvantaged. As I say, my efforts have been confined to the academic sphere and to try to sort of create a space for progressive ideas within philosophy, particularly within political philosophy, and to sort of expand the sort of beachhead of the progressive, because there are some progressives in the profession. Much more has been done by white feminist theorists. There's now a significant body of white feminist work, which does reflect very well on the efforts of white feminist philosophers of the past few decades. But as I mentioned, comparable body of work on race is far less. So that's basically where I've been putting my energies. So I'm delighted to be invited to this session, but it wasn't false modesty. I do defer to those people who have been active in this country, which is you guys, not me.
Charles. So John, what do you want?
Oh, I just thought you might want to also respond to the question of sort of, for someone wanting to get involved in
Oh,
activism, what to
absolutely.
read, what to...
I think Janaé nailed it, but I think that it's not that complicated. We have two young journalists staying with us from Switzerland, and we just made a brief survey of what's going on the few days they were here, and we can't do everything. I mean, it's just too much going on in Chicago. And part of the way that we stay kind of in little bunkers is that we don't raise up and pay attention to all that's going on. So you want to get involved in activism, the thing is there's something happening all the time. Art exhibits, openings, lectures, discussions, analysis, and you find something you care about, and then you apprentice yourself to that organization. You go to learn, you go to understand, and then you follow along. And as you follow along, you'll become more sophisticated and more engaged, if that's the direction you want to go. I mean, the point is paying attention and deciding that you're going to live a life in concert with your values drives you to kind of find out what's out there. And then you apprentice yourself and learn. And as my partner, a former law professor, always says is, if in the course of your apprenticeship, going to graduate school or going to law school makes sense, do it. But don't do it if it doesn't make sense in something, in terms of something you're passionate about. So that would be, one part of the answer. The other thing I think is worth responding to quickly is this notion of inside the system, outside the system. I've tried to work outside the system my whole life, but unfortunately capitalism is all around me. I can't get away from it. So, I'm in the system, everybody's in the system. The question is, what are you doing in that system? What are you trying to do? What are you awake to? What are you using resources for? And I don't just mean material resources. I mean intellectual resources and literary resources and artistic resources. How are we leveraging ourselves, in my opinion, to build a movement? And sometimes, yes, we get in the door, but the question always for me around elections or getting in the door is, what are we trying to do in here? I mean, if systemic change is what we want, Rahm Emanuel's not bringing that to us. So Janae's point about never giving up on mobilizing people, mobilizing workers, mobilizing neighborhoods, mobilizing students, never give up on that. But we're not going to get to where we need to go if we don't walk on two legs. One is constant mobilization and the other is looking at power. We have to look at power, and we should look at power. but it's not going to come to us, you know, without resistance. And so I think we do both. We do all of it. But if I go into a meeting with anybody in power, my question is, what am I learning? What do I need to do? Not is the boss going to give me what I need? He is not. He is not going to give you what you need. Not even Bernie Sanders. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. Like going to protests, going to events, teach-ins, art exhibits, all of those things, like are definitely ways to plug in. I totally overlooked what you said about reading materials. I will say that the autobiographies of Assata Shakur and the autobiography of Malcolm X changed my life.
Yeah.
Especially the autobiography of Assata Shakur. Like that, I think after reading that is, I definitely felt a lot. So I would probably start with those two. That was my gateway into being politicized, so to speak.
You mentioned memoir. I mean, some of my favorite memoirs are even more recent. Assata's memoir is great, but Ta-Nehisi Coates' memoir, the one he wrote before this most famous book, wow, you know, The Beautiful Struggle, what a great book. Reading about people's lives, Claudia Rankin's Citizen, you know, there's so many things right now. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm kind of, you know, I've always been kind of nerdy too. I always carry books with me to wherever I'm going to be sitting. Look, I brought all these books here for no reason. I just put them there because I don't want to be without them. What if the place falls in? I gotta have something to read.
Hey, you know what's great reading though? There's this document
Oh
called
yeah.
The Agenda to Build Black Futures.
And you can find it online too.
You can find it online. Yours truly is a co-author. Drafted several sections of it. It is at agendatobuildblackfutures.org, available for full download. It is an economic justice platform that was developed by young black folks. We collectively, identified what the problems are and what's possible policy recommendations, and it's really bold and audacious, but includes the thoroughness of receipts. And what I mean by that is, like, it's not just, we just have this have these ideas that are not backed up or substantiated with history and rationale for why we're calling for it. So when we say for things like reparations, which is a word that can shut down any conversation, we say, but wait, here's what it means and here's why it's deserving and why it's feasible and how it's feasible. So, shameless plug, but I definitely encourage everyone to go and download The Agenda to Build Black Futures because I think it's a great document. And what I hope will kind of lead this movement into not a different direction necessarily, but move it beyond just the sole narrative of police violence. Because the problems that we face in this country is definitely way more multifaceted than police misconduct. Good reading.
Question back there?
Hi. My name is Jorge Capo. I'm a student of anthropology. First of all, thanks for the very energizing conversation. It's just great to know that I'm from Mexico City, so it's very satisfying to know that there's politics in the streets of this country. But I was wondering, I wanted to go back to an earlier point that you touched on, actually both of you touched on it. Your efforts to understand the contemporary moment, the present situation, the connections that actually transcend the city, but also national borders. So in that regard, I was wondering if you had made some sort of effort to reach out to the students in South Africa, because they are having the exact same conversations regarding race, regarding the disillusionment with electoral politics, regarding representation, the modes of political involvement, modes of political mobilization, and it's all within the same kind of spontaneous articulation. There are movements called Roads Must Fall, and then we call it Peace Must Fall, and the debate is very heated, and I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of things that together, and the students in South Africa and you guys, could exchange. And there's a long tradition of connections between, the civil rights movement and the anti-apartheid struggle. And I think, and that takes me, that was just one thing that I was curious about, and that takes me to a second comment, which might be a little more pedantic, but I apologize in advance.
Not for this crowd.
I was a little shocked by the sharp distinction between praxis and philosophy that seemed to emerge in the conversation. Because, you know, beyond strategic protest and the symbolic victories and all those things that you do, the praxis, are already articulating, let's say, the political philosophy of the possible, which is something that you suggested at the beginning, moving from the politics of the probable to the politics of the possible. And that is articulating what you're doing. So the kind of self-reflection that is needed to put that into sort of program has to be included in the practice. I mean, we cannot say, yeah, philosophers are doing their thing and we are mobilizing and doing our thing. I think both of those things are imbricated. You know, and that's a sort of a Fanonian thing. You know, from Fanoni's perspective of the earth, he argues something like this. Because that would perhaps open the horizon for this kind of thinking. But well, that was just a pedantic point.
That's it.
Yeah. I mean, in short answers to the first question, no, we haven't reached out to students in South Africa. But like I totally see the parallels in our struggles here and their struggles in over there. And I think that yeah, there's a lot of like political quilting that needs to happen. You know, both nationally and globally. And I'm sure we can do a better job of that. I don't even know how to go about making that link.
You guys have to talk after. We have to talk afterwards, absolutely.
Yeah, we should do that.
You know, because the point that Jorge makes is so very important. The issues that impact us, white supremacy, war, global climate change, catastrophic climate change, international human rights, the issues that we care about, genocide, are issues that are worldwide issues. And the exportation of the problems that imperialism has at home is a characteristic of the modern age. So fighting against war, linking that to white supremacy, linking that to immigrant rights, linking that to queer rights, I mean, these things are naturally coming together if you look closely enough. So part of our job, I think, is you know, as I said, is reframing the issues. We don't want to talk about Obamacare or not Obamacare. That's not the debate I'm in. Free health care is what I want to talk about. We don't want to talk about this many wars or that many wars. No, I want to talk about peace. So, you know, these are the kinds of things we have to reframe, but we have to see that they're linked up, and then we have to fight the system. But in our globalizing world, I'm convinced that what used to be referred to as the industrial proletariat, it's now an international working class. It's going to be an international working class that takes down the headquarters of war and empire, the headquarters of white supremacy, the headquarters of predatory zombie capitalism. But it's only going to happen, if we link up with others, and that can be done very, very consciously and worked at. But it's not automatic, like everything else. It has to be worked at.
Actually,
go ahead.
Well, I have a question sort of about the political quilting, or the quilting you were talking about, and just goes to the question of audience for protests and also who your allies are. When I was reading your economic agenda, I mean, there are a lot of things in there that obviously don't apply just to black people. There's a lot of working class white people and people who might be voting for Donald Trump who are angry about a lot of the same things, are dealing with a lot of the same problems. And so I guess I was curious, for Bill or Janaé, when you're in one of these activist movements, obviously we have a country where there are a lot of people where the problem isn't just awareness, they're hostile to a lot of these movements, but at the same time, they're affected by many of the same things. I remember, Bill, actually, last time we talked, you said you were working on a book called Palin Around, talking to the Tea Party.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, I'm just curious if you guys have thought about that, is it possible to reach some of those people who wouldn't agree with you on everything, but there are a lot of intersecting interests?
Not only is it possible, it's necessary. And it's necessary, the essence of democratic living is talking to strangers. So I wrote a chapter in the book that I did, and the chapter was called Talking to the Tea Party. And the reason is because I used to get picketed whenever I'd give a talk, not here, thank God. But, you know, and I went out and talked to the pickets one day, and they had a sign that said, Ayers should go to jail. And I said, why do you dislike me? And they said, well, we heard you're a friend of Obama's, we dislike him. Well, that's not fair, you know, guilt by association. But then I said, you know, but then I saw one guy wearing a Rand Paul shirt. Is that, not Rand Paul, Ron Paul. And I said, I bet you and I agree on a lot of things. And he said, really, like what? And I said, like full queer rights, including the right to marry. And he said, no, marriage is, the state shouldn't be involved. I said, okay, full queer rights and no one gets married. And he said, yes. So we agreed. And the woman standing next to him wearing a wooden cross said, you think that? That's an abomination. She was part of the same picket line, right? So I think there are all kinds of engines and levers and entry points. But, and this gets to a debate that's going on right now between the Bernie Sanders full-out defenders, and I'm going to vote for him, don't worry. He's a good Franklin Roosevelt Democrat. I like him better than anybody I've ever seen run for president except George McGovern, but okay, whatever. So,
Don't scare
but,
people.
huh?
Don't scare people.
Yeah, but there's a debate going on right now between the hardcore Bernie Sanders camp and Ta-Nehisi Coates, who raised the question of reparations. And the response, more interesting than the initial mistake, in my view, is the response, which reveals all kinds of white blind spots in the left. And by white blind spot, I mean not being able to recognize the specific damage and specific harm that's specifically aimed at a specific group of people historically right up to this moment. And if you don't recognize that, and you say, as Coates pointed out, you know, if you say, well, if we have a good, you know, a good education system, that will help everybody. Turns out that kind of universalist thinking actually has betrayed black people again and again and again. So we have to be serious. Yes, I want allies. Yes, I want to talk to everybody. Yes, I want to reach across into the most lunatic places and have debates and discussions. But I don't want to go in there and say, okay, well, we can smooth over our, let's not see race. Let's keep that in a closet until Bernie gets elected. No, I disagree with that. It has to be out of the closet. It has to be in our conversation. It has to be honest.
Yeah. I know we're probably running out of time, but I'll just add to that really quickly that, you know, I've heard a lot of pushback about the role of identity politics in this movement. People say, you know, it's divisive for you to have, you know, an organization that, you know, is exclusively black or black-led, or for you to use or to center blackness in your advocacy or whatever. The agenda to build black futures. What about all futures? All lives matter. Everybody's lives matter. Yeah, that's true, right? But I think the issue is, well, I mean, the necessity for black only or black led organizations is something different. I think people should have the right to have a space of shared identity, and that's something separate from what I'm trying to say, which is when you're talking about a people that is kind of last in all things that are good and first in all things that are bad. To put it simply, when you center the most marginalized, when you center the most oppressed, when they win, everyone else in turn wins, right? Because if you look to use history as a proxy, if you look at like the New Deal, for example, or you look at like the GI Bill, if you're looking at it from a colorblind lens, like, yeah, it was super successful, yeah. You know? But like black folks didn't benefit from the New Deal, black folks didn't benefit from the GI Bill, nor did queer folks. And so, you know, when BYP 100 says that we organize through a black queer feminist praxis, that essentially means that we're radically inclusive to center marginalized communities within marginalized communities. So not just so recognizing that blackness is not a monolith, but there's a black trans person or a black undocumented person or the poorest of the poor face compounded oppressions relative to a cis heterosexual black man, for example. And so it's really, I think identity politics strengthens movements and not weakens them. And that's not to say that that doesn't make space for coalition building and allyship, because that absolutely happens. We've had joint actions with the Not One More campaign and or organized communities against deportations. You know, the Fight for 15 is a great example of a Black-Brown coalition. Like that cross-pollination, so to speak, is happening because we do recognize that that a lot of the conditions that we're facing is connected. I don't think that universal child care, for example, is something that only single black mothers could you know, benefit from. Everyone can, but it's just if we are vigilant about censoring those who are most likely to be overlooked and left out of a colorblind policy, then we can ensure liberation for everyone. So that's my case for identity politics in this movement.
And if I could just weigh in briefly with a philosophical note, I heard the words universalism, so my ears pricked up.
Yeah.
Yes, so yes, it sort of goes back to the point I was trying to make at the start, that in conceptualizing issues of justice, in sort of working with a particular intellectual framework, the problem is that the white left in this country has imported these categories across the Atlantic from a European background where race, domestically, was much less central. Race was important with respect to the colonized countries across the ocean, but domestic was less important. In this country, race is central. So universalism, as it sort of usually played out in the white left, has basically been universalism across the white population.
Exactly.
So you then get the possibility of a New Deal that excludes the categories of agricultural workers and domestic workers, I think it was,
Yes.
which basically meant the black population, or the GI Bill, as Eric Casselson pointed out, when affirmative action was white. You know, had the GI Bill been implemented in a racial inclusive fashion, it's quite possible that many of the problems we're having now, we would not be having these
That's
problems.
right. Yeah.
So insofar as philosophy can sort of give some useful input, it has to in part with how we conceptualize stuff, like liberalism, universalism, socialism, pointing out the extent to which in this country there have been these racial exclusions all throughout them. So the specific problems of populations of color have had to do with the need to have, as I said, corrective justice, which is different from distributive justice, which is really predicated on the white working class experience, and not the sort of need to make up for the injustice of the past, which continue to sort of have their presence felt today in statistics in terms of wealth, in terms of life expectancies, in terms of infant mortality rates, in terms of segregation education, all that stuff, that's the legacy of the past, which cannot be solved by sort of trying to dissolve them into sort of white male universalism, which is really particularistic.
That's exactly right.
Colorblindness is a myth.
Woo!
Yes.
Thank God there's a philosopher here. Wow.
So see,
But
not entirely useless.
not at all useless. Very useful. The head and the hand have to go together. But you know, I'm wearing this T-shirt, Black Lives Matter. So I was wearing it in Ann Arbor last week, and a woman got up during question and answer, and she said, "I'm a Christian, so I object to your T-shirt. It should say all lives matter." And I said, "It doesn't say only Black Lives Matter." That was the first thing I said. And I said, and if I were wearing a T-shirt that said, "Stop sexual violence against women at Michigan," would you stand up and say we should stop sexual violence against men and women? Because I agree, I don't want sexual violence against men, but you're diluting the very specific harm that's being done. And so, you know, it's an argument we have to have. It's an argument we need to educate people about. But I think it's been bold and brave. Black Lives Matter, exclamation point. That has changed the discourse in this country, and that's not going back. So this is an important moment, and I think we have to all be grateful to Janaé and her comrades for putting it on the table.
I think, is it quick?
I don't know if it's quick. It's a question for Charles about this project, which I view as extremely important.
Me too.
And I would like to hear more about the, overcoming cognitive imperialism requires building, new fields in ideology. And I most readily turn to post-colonial theory, but I'm wondering if that does not address the philosophy of political economy that you are interested in, because I think of Chakrabarty or Gandhi or Kwame Anthony Appiah as thinkers who are contributing to this realm, but if this question is beyond the bounds of what you want to talk about, I can talk to you after.
I'd like to hear the answer.
Me too. Yeah.
Okay, what I've been trying to do in recent years, guys, may come as a shock, so please don't, walk out in disgust as I say it. I'm trying to radicalize liberalism. And for many people, this is a contradiction in terms, and they now cross the street when they see me coming. But here's the case for it. Liberalism historically is predicated on the flourishing of individuals. The idea that individuals should have equal moral status and that should have an equal chance to flourish. Now, liberalism in actual history has been quite different. But there's no mystery why this has happened. It's because the dominant recognized thinkers have primarily been privileged white males. So you then get a liberalism that's classist, that's patriarchal, and that's racist. In other words, this should not be in the least surprising to us. So my argument is that liberalism has a radical potential that has basically not been allowed to develop because of the material factors in terms of the privileging of certain bodies as those who are sort of appropriately designated the liberal thinkers to which we should respond. So feminist liberal theory is an attempt to sort of extend liberal principles across the gender lines in the public-private boundary. And an argument is that you can get a radical racial liberalism, which I'm now calling black radical liberalism, and one of those seemingly oxymoronic phrases. And what you basically do is take into account the actual history, not the sanitized history, which you get in our textbooks, where liberalism includes everybody, but the actual history, which has Thomas Jefferson sort of declaring, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, while simultaneously owning slaves. So my argument is that liberalism has been patriarchal, liberalism has been racial, liberalism has been classist. So the question would then be, how do we need to rethink the ontology of liberalism to take into account this history of subordination, and how do we need to sort of rethink the focus of justice theory? So the focus of justice theory becomes corrective justice for the subordinated. And as I said earlier, the startling thing about the resurrection of social justice theory in Anglo-American philosophical circles is that this whole area, which is should really be the most important thing, the corrective justice for the subordinated, is basically not on the table at all. So my argument is that you shouldn't be sort of blinded by existing liberalism to think that's all that's possible. A radical liberalism that's quite different from sort of dominant forms of liberalism is possible. And the great virtue this would have is that to then make it possible to engage with the mainstream political philosophy of this country. Because anybody you read, people like Louis Hartz in the 1950s, Nadal and so forth, liberalism has always been the dominant ideology in the United States. But it's been an exclusionary liberalism, and liberalism basically for white males, in fact, property white males up to Jacksonian democracy, when you get sort of extension of the franchise to white males in general. So that a liberalism is possible that is radically different and is hardly imaginable to us because of the fact of our consciousness being colonized by the existing liberalisms that have basically ruled the world for the past few hundred years. So as I say, don't dismiss the idea out of hand. Ask yourself what a liberalism would look like if it took gender subordination seriously into account, if it took racial subordination seriously into account, if it took plutocracy seriously into account. You would then get a liberalism I'm claiming that is radically different from the kinds that we've known for the past few hundred years.
Woo! Damn! Ask him another question. Ask him another question.
We'll be back for our next panel. What is liberalism for? Or who is liberalism for? Okay, so I think we're gonna wrap up. Thank you guys so much for coming. We'll be posting a video of the talk within the next week, and we'll let you know when we do.